Left my spouse to care for dying ex. When I found out the truth, it was too late. I left my husband to go care for my ex who was going through a terminal illness. 3 years later he passed away. I returned to my husband's house, but he no longer wants to accept me just because I got pregnant by my ex. The day I sat in front of the judge with my son on my lap and everyone looking at me as if I were some kind of scammer, I heard for the first time out loud that the man I cared for until he died couldn't even have been my child's father. I felt the floor disappear beneath my feet while Javier's family lawyer talked about sterility, dates, and lies, as if I were a clinical case and not a woman who left everything for love. You want to understand how I ended up becoming that caricature? We need to go back to when I still believed the world owed me something for everything I was sacrificing. When I left the house I shared with Rodrigo, I felt more relief than fear. Behind were his annoying silences, his mother's disapproving looks every time I mentioned Javier, and that constant feeling that I had to ask permission to feel. Rodrigo was always correct, organized, stable, but he never understood that a person doesn't just turn off from one day to the next just because they got married. Javier had been my first great love, the one who taught me to live alone, to pay bills, to dream about children. When he called that night with his broken voice saying he had advanced cancer, something inside me lit up. I felt that if I didn't go to him, I would be haunted by the idea of having left him to die alone. I remember Rodrigo's face when I told him. He said he was sorry, that we could support Javier from afar, help with medicines, contribute some money if necessary. I listened to him talk about boundaries, respect for marriage, taking care of our relationship, and I only saw selfishness disguised as maturity. I told him I couldn't sit idly by knowing Javier needed me, that it wasn't about romance but about humanity. He answered that I was his wife, not an ex-boyfriend's nurse who was crossing a line. There was a long argument, full of reproaches from him and tears from me, until I understood he was never going to see it my way. So I did what I had to do. I packed my clothes in the big suitcase, the same one we used for our honeymoon trip, and left the keys on the dining room table. Rodrigo watched me from the hallway with that mix of rage and childish disappointment that irritated me so much. He asked me if I was sure about what I was doing, if I was really going to abandon our house for a sick man with whom I no longer had anything. I told him he didn't understand, that someday he would see I was doing the right thing. I closed the door without looking back. As I went down the stairs, I kept telling myself that time would put everything in its place, and that later he would be grateful to have been married to someone capable of such sacrifice. With Javier, the world was reduced to the hospital and his apartment. Mornings were for tests and appointments, afternoons for medications and naps, nights for fever and whispers. I learned to identify his pains by the way he frowned, to change sweat-soaked sheets at 3 in the morning, to convince him to eat even if it was just a few spoonfuls of soup. The doctors talked about protocols, statistics, and phases, but for me it wasn't a case. It was proof that I could still do something right. His family came and went, they took turns, but in the end it was me they called when there was an emergency. I was the one who was there when he threw up, when he got dizzy, when he suffocated with anxiety. Over time I stopped going back and forth and settled into his apartment. I started sleeping on the couch, and on a small bed we put in his room so I could get up quickly if he needed something. I controlled his pills, organized appointments, answered messages from friends asking how he was doing. Javier looked at me with grateful eyes, saying he didn't know what he would have done without me, that I was his guardian angel. He talked to me about the guilt he felt about how we had ended before, about having been immature, about not knowing how to take care of me. I didn't need him to beat himself up. It was enough for me to accept that in the end he had chosen to stay with me to face the ugliest part of his life. He began to say he didn't want to leave me helpless. Between one hospitalization and another, he searched on his phone for insurance options, asked me about my debts, talked about the possibility of making me the beneficiary of some policy, of leaving me at least part of the apartment. His siblings didn't look favorably on that. I noticed it in how they looked at me when they heard him mention my name alongside the word inheritance. But Javier was stubborn in his lucid moments. He said I had left a comfortable life and a marriage to care for him, that it was the least he could do, and I deep down felt it was fair. In the middle of that routine of hospitals and suffering, sometimes I needed air. One night, after they adjusted his medication and he fell asleep early, a friend texted me. She told me she was nearby, that I should go out for a bit, that I was going to go crazy if I didn't see anything other than an 4 drip. I hesitated for 5 minutes, looked at Javier breathing deeply. I told his mother I would go out for a bit and that she could stay, and I left. We arrived at a bar with loud music, low lights, and the smell of alcohol mixed with cheap perfume. I ordered a drink, then another, and for the first time in a long time I felt that I wasn't just a sick person's caregiver, but a woman. At some point in the night, a man approached me. He was one of those guys who know they're attractive, with an easy smile and confident hands. We talked about anything, music, work, nothing important. He asked if I was alone. I answered more or less. He said I should just think about myself for one night. The rest slipped by on its own. We ended up in an unfamiliar bed, with agitated breathing and a mind intoxicated with exhaustion and alcohol. I wasn't in love. I don't even remember his face well. But in that moment I felt I deserved a couple of hours of disconnection, of not thinking about chemotherapies or pain. When I returned to Javier's apartment at dawn, the world resumed its course as if nothing had happened. I washed my face, prepared breakfast, answered a call from the doctor. The previous night became a parenthesis I preferred not to look at directly. I repeated to myself that no one could judge me for seeking a break in the middle of that hell, that if the roles were reversed, anyone would have done something similar. I told Javier I had gone out to clear my head with a friend. He just caressed my hand and said he hoped I also thought about myself from time to time. This story is about to take an unexpected turn. Before we continue, if you're shocked by what you're hearing, hit that subscribe button and leave a like. Tell me in the comments, was she wrong to leave her husband? Let's continue. A few weeks later, I started noticing strange things in my body. Constant tiredness, morning nausea, smells that bothered me. I bought a pregnancy test almost by inertia, more to rule it out than anything else. When I saw the 2 marked lines, I felt my heart take a strange leap. I sat on the edge of the bathtub with the strip in my hand, silently measuring possibilities. I could play dumb, I could think about dates and calculator in hand, but at that moment what weighed most wasn't the data but what I needed to be true. I decided the child was Javier's, not because I could prove it on a calendar, but because that child was what closed the whole story the way it had to close. It was the child we didn't have when we were young, the result of having stayed with him until the end, proof that something alive had come out of so much pain. I went into his room with the test in my pocket. I looked at him while he was lying down, pale but awake, and told him I thought I was pregnant. His eyes filled with tears. He took my hand with what little strength he had left and started talking about hope, about how that baby was going to be the light in the middle of everything, about how we had to fight a little more. From that moment on, everything started revolving around that idea. I talked to his family as if the pregnancy were a done deal, as if everyone knew that child was his. His mother was cold, but she didn't deny it either. Javier, when he had good days, caressed my still flat belly and said he wanted to leave something for his child, that he wasn't going to allow him to grow up without support. The doctors, on their side, remained professional and distant. For them, the tumor continued its course, the medication was adjusted, the prognosis didn't change because something else was happening in my body. The end came on a Thursday around 5 in the morning. The sound of machines in the hospital, the smell of disinfectant and sweat, the bluish light of dawn coming through the window, everything mixed into a scene that still visits me in dreams. Javier was breathing with difficulty, squeezing my hand. He said a few words I barely understood, something about taking care of myself, about the baby, about trusting me. His mother was at the foot of the bed. Brother was talking to a doctor in the hallway. When the line on the monitor stabilized into a single long sound, I knew he was gone, but my head took time to accept it. I stayed still with his cold hand in mine until a nurse kindly asked me to leave. On the hospital papers I appeared as live-in partner and primary caregiver. Nobody asked me too much. They simply copied what the family already took for granted. At the wake, I was the one who sat closest to the coffin, the one who received condolence hugs, the one who listened to stories from when he was healthy. Javier's family appropriated the narrative of the child who was on the way, but they never quite included me. They introduced me to some as the girlfriend who came back, to others as the person who cared for him until the end. I nodded, with my belly still small, convinced that time would again finish arranging those labels. After the burial, Javier's house filled with boxes, papers, practical decisions. His siblings started talking about selling the apartment, settling debts, closing accounts. I still lived there, surrounded by memories and things that, according to them, no longer belonged to me. There were tense meetings, comments about how being married made everything complicated, insinuations that it would be best if I looked for another place. The pregnancy progressed, my belly grew, and with each centimeter I felt my right to be there increased, although no one else seemed to see it that way. With my son's birth, priorities changed suddenly. The first months were a mix of sleepless nights, diapers, crying, and a thick sadness that wouldn't go away. Javier's family visited him from time to time, brought some gifts, took photos, but there was never a clear conversation about responsibilities. I started moving on my own. I sold some furniture that no one claimed. I accepted occasional jobs. I ended up renting a small room in a cheaper neighborhood when it became evident they no longer wanted me to stay in Javier's apartment. Time passed in blows. When my son turned 2, I was already exhausted. I earned little, paid a lot, adjusted accounts all the time. The room where we lived was narrow. The noise of buses came up through the window. The refrigerator was sometimes almost empty. I started looking back at the life I had with Rodrigo. It wasn't perfect, but there was a roof of our own, guaranteed food, stability. I thought that he, as decent as he always believed himself to be, wouldn't be capable of leaving a woman and a child on the street, no matter how resentful he was. I convinced myself that the time had come to recover what was mine. Rodrigo had always wanted children. He talked about that before everything went to hell. In my head it made sense that after what had happened he would take me back, even if it was because of the child. I started imagining scenes where I saw myself arriving at the house, him opening the door, looking at us, breaking a little inside, and accepting that destiny was pushing us to rebuild what had fallen apart. I kept telling telling myself that in the end I hadn't done anything except follow the path of my heart. One Monday at 9 in the morning, I stood in front of what had been our house with the child in my arms and two small suitcases. I dressed in the best clothes I had, fixed up the child a bit, combed his hair, rang the doorbell with a mix of nerves and confidence. While I waited, I looked at the facade I knew by heart, the window of our old room, the small garden I had helped plant myself. I felt that somehow I was closing a circle. Rodrigo opened the door with the face of someone not expecting anyone important. His gaze went from my face to the child, from the suitcases to my worn shoes. I didn't see in his eyes the break I had imagined so many times, but something colder, more distant. I started talking fast as if I could beat time. I told him Javier had died, that I had cared for him until the end, that the child needed a real home, that this was still my house. I reminded him that I had always been a present partner, that what had happened with my ex was an exceptional situation. It didn't take long to cut me off. Without raising his voice, he told me to wait, that he'd be right back. He went in, left the door ajar, and after a few minutes came back with an envelope in his hand. He handed it to me without ceremony. Inside were copies of a divorce sentence, dates, signatures, seals. Divorce for unjustified abandonment of the home. It had been 2 years already. There were also papers for the sale of the house. He said he no longer lived there, that he had only gone to drop off some things, that the new owners were moving in the next day. And he finished by saying that I wasn't his problem, that child wasn't his, and that if I insisted on staying, he would have to call the police. I tried to appeal to memories. I talked to him about our dinners, the plans we once made, how much it had meant to me. I pointed to the child. I reminded him he had always wanted to be a father, that it made no sense for him now to refuse to give me a hand. He just looked at me with a mix of exhaustion and determination and repeated that he owed me nothing. He told me that when I left I had chosen, that I couldn't come back as if nothing had happened with another man's child and pretend life had frozen waiting for me. The door closed with a soft click, but the sound echoed in my head. I stood on the sidewalk with the morning sun hitting my face, the child starting to cry, and the suitcases weighing more than they actually weighed. I looked at the house facade one more time, knowing I no longer had any place there. I felt a strange mix of disbelief and injustice. After everything I had left behind, everything I had cared for and endured, no one seemed willing to acknowledge my sacrifice. To the world, I was just the woman who abandoned her husband for a sick ex and came back with a child nobody asked for. Date 1. After that scene at the door, I knew Rodrigo wasn't going to be an option. Not because I couldn't try again, but because his reaction made it clear he had decided to erase me, arrange his life without me, and play the dignified one in the process. I sat for a while in a nearby plaza with the child in the stroller and the suitcases to one side, and I started mentally reviewing what I had and what I didn't. I had no house, no husband, no steady job. The only thing I had was the complete story of what I had done for Javier and the child, who for me was the last tie to him. When I stopped to think coldly, I saw that the only place where I could still claim something was in the past I built with my ex. I started introducing myself everywhere as Javier's widow. The word came out naturally, almost automatically. Nobody was going to check if there were officially signed papers or not. In the neighborhood where I now rented, the neighbors knew me as the girl who had left everything to care for a sick man and was now raising alone the child he left behind. When I ran into any of Javier's relatives on the street or at the supermarket and they referred to me as the girl who cared for him, I corrected them calmly, saying I was his partner, the mother of his child. I didn't raise my voice, didn't make scenes, I just repeated what for me was a fact. One day, going through an old folder that had been left in a cardboard box, I found something that became my anchor. It was a draft will that Javier had once started. It wasn't complete or formally signed, but there in his handwriting appeared his intention to leave me part of the apartment and a small policy so I wouldn't be left helpless. It wasn't a perfect document, it wasn't the magic solution, but it was proof that he had thought about me beyond the hospital. Seeing my name written on that paper gave me back a sense of entitlement I thought was lost. With that draft in hand, I went to see a neighborhood lawyer someone recommended. The office was on a second floor with peeling walls, but I didn't care. I sat in front of him and told him my complete version. I told him I had left my husband to care for Javier, that I had settled in with him, that I accompanied him until his last breath, that I was pregnant when he died, and that the child was his son. I told him about the draft will, the promises to protect me, how the family had taken advantage of grief to get me out of the apartment and divide everything up. The lawyer listened attentively, reviewed the papers, asked some questions. He didn't seem scandalized, more analytical. He said the situation wasn't simple, but it wasn't impossible either. He mentioned that although we hadn't been married, he could try to prove cohabitation, economic dependence, even the existence of a child who had been left helpless. He pointed to the draft will as an interesting element, proof of intention. He talked to me about deadlines, lawsuits, the possibility of claiming part of the assets and some type of compensation. I left that office with something I hadn't felt in a long time, the feeling that not everything was lost. For the first time since Javier had died, someone was putting into words something I had always felt, that it wasn't fair for his family to keep everything as if I had been just a hospital companion. I started imagining what I could achieve if the trial went in my favor. I wasn't talking about luxuries, but stability, a roof of my own, a bank account that wasn't always in the red, a decent school for my son, a kind of compensation for the years I had given. When the lawyer told me he saw potential in the case and was willing to take it, I felt the world had a little order again. He explained that we would have to gather evidence, photos, messages, medical reports where my presence was recorded, testimonies from neighbors and friends who knew I lived with Javier. He also mentioned the need to make it clear the child was his son as a key element to reinforce the claim. For me, that wasn't a problem. I had always talked about my son as Javier's son. I saw no reason to doubt it. Now I decided to move forward with everything. I signed documents, authorized the lawyer to represent me, committed to getting names, papers, anything that would help. I didn't experience it as a risky move, but as an act of minimal justice. After having left a stable husband and a resolved life to accompany a man in the worst stage of his existence, the least I could expect was a part of what he left behind. I wasn't going to let them reduce me to a blurred memory or a footnote in the story of his illness. If the only way for them to recognize what I did was before a judge, then that's what had to be done. Update 2. When the lawyer formally filed the inheritance claim, everything that until then had been memory and paper became a legal file. He asked me for contact information for Javier's family, addresses, phone numbers, anything that would serve to notify them. I gave them to him without trembling. I didn't feel I was hurting them. I felt I was simply moving a piece they had refused to recognize. While I signed some more pages, he explained that once they received the notification they would have time to respond, that they would probably get angry and there would be tension, but that was part of the process. I nodded. Tension was what there had been since I appeared in Javier's life, so nothing new. The reaction didn't take long to arrive. The first to call me was his mother to a number I barely used. I didn't answer. Then audios started arriving from one of his siblings full of reproaches. He said I was using Javier's name, that I was taking advantage of his memory, that he never wanted to leave me anything, and that what I had to do was work and stop looking at other people's accounts. I listened to the audios alone in the kitchen of the rented room while my son played on the floor with an old toy car. I didn't respond immediately. I knew that if I did while hot, they would use any word of mine against me. When I finally answered, I did it the way that always worked for me, calmly and remembering details they preferred to forget. I explained that nobody had been with Javier as long as I had, that while they took turns for visits, I was the one who stayed at 3 in the morning changing sheets, the one who cleaned vomit from the floor, the one who signed documents when they weren't there. I told them I wasn't asking for anything that hadn't already been mentioned while he was alive, that I just wanted what Javier had expressed to be respected. They insisted the draft will wasn't valid, that I was manipulating the situation, that I was inventing rights. I kept repeating that nobody was giving me back the years I left there. I started using my social media differently. Instead of sharing random photos of my son or cheap motivational phrases, I wrote about the wear of caring for someone until the end and then being erased from the story as if nothing had happened. I didn't put names, but anyone who knew the case could connect the dots. I uploaded old photos of Javier, blurry or taken from angles where you only saw a hand, a silhouette, a profile. I wrote things like, "It hurts to see how blood divides everything and the one who was really there is treated like a nuisance." Some friends commented that I was strong, that God saw everything, that justice came late but it came. Others just left a heart and disappeared from the chat. At least I felt I wasn't swallowing the story alone. In the neighborhood, the narrative also accommodated what I needed. When someone asked why I was in court, I said Javier wanted to leave something for his son and his family had opposed out of pure meanness. I didn't go into technical details. Nobody asked for them. For most people it was simple. A woman who cared for a sick man until the end, a small child, a cold family that wanted to keep everything. Nobody sat down to review dates or medical reports in the middle of the corner store. Those things are for people who have time to waste. I just repeated the part that mattered, that there were sacrifices that couldn't go unrecognized. Meanwhile, my lawyer was building the case. He asked me for screenshots of messages where Javier thanked me, reports where it was recorded that I sometimes signed for him, photos of us in the apartment, even supermarket receipts that showed we lived as a couple. He talked to me about witnesses, about neighbors in the building who could testify they saw me coming and going every day, about nurses who might remember I was always the one at the bedside. I moved as I could, knocking on doors, remembering faces, insisting they accept to speak when necessary. In my head, all that wasn't just a cold procedure. It was also a kind of trial against the family's version. They always wanted to paint me as the one who disorganized Javier, who distracted him, who took him away from his correct path. Now finally, there would be a place where someone with authority would hear that I was the one who held everything together when they didn't know what to do with so much pain. It wasn't just about money, although I needed it like air. It was about putting things in the place where they should have been from the beginning. I felt that if the judge ruled in my favor, the whole world would be forced to admit I hadn't ruined my life on a whim, but for a cause that was worthwhile. Update 3. The day of the key hearing arrived faster than I would have wanted. The courthouse was an old building with long hallways and the smell of humidity mixed with sweat. I got up very early to get the child ready, put reasonably presentable clothes on him, and prepare a little bag with toys, wipes, something to eat. I had no one to leave him with, so I took him with me. I thought that maybe seeing him there, so small, so clearly in need of support, would soften those who had to decide a bit. My lawyer had asked me to be calm, to speak only when asked, not to react to provocations. Entering the courtroom was like walking onto a stage where everyone had already decided what role I had. Javier's family was sitting sitting together, neat, serious. The mother with a sober handkerchief, the siblings with their usual faces as if nothing directly touched them. Their lawyer had a very thick folder full of meticulously arranged papers. Mine, on the other hand, carried a thinner folder, but with what he considered sufficient. I sat behind him with my son on my lap. The child played with a plastic toy car, oblivious to everything. The hearing began with formalities, full names, identity documents, reading of what was being claimed. My lawyer presented first. He spoke of my cohabitation with Javier, of the years we left behind that were resumed when he was diagnosed with the illness. He said I had given up a resolved life to care for a man who was terminally ill, that I had been his main support, that there was even a child fruit of that bond who had been left without adequate protection. He mentioned the draft will, Javier's messages, my constant presence in medical reports. I listened to him speak and nodded internally. I felt that finally someone was putting into words everything nobody had wanted to look at seriously. When it was my turn to testify, I told what I had already told 1,000 times, how I left Rodrigo, how I settled into Javier's apartment, how I accompanied him to every chemotherapy. I explained that the pregnancy came in the middle of all that for us it was a sign of hope, that Javier was excited about the idea of leaving something for his son. I didn't go into details that didn't apply to the case. I limited myself to what supported the claim. Then came the turn of the family's lawyer. At first he spoke generally. He said they respected my pain, that they recognized my participation in Javier's final stage, but that didn't automatically make me an heir. Up to there everything sounded like an expected speech, but then he started pulling out papers I had never seen, detailed medical reports, precise dates, protocols that honestly I never cared to read with such depth when I was involved in all that. One of the documents was a report from the oncologist and another from a fertility specialist. There it was recorded that due to chemotherapy and other complications, Javier had become sterile and without the ability to maintain complete relations many months before the probable date of conception of my child. The lawyer said it in his neutral, almost bored tone, as if he were reading the weather forecast. Then he added that according to those same reports, there was no biological possibility that Javier was the child's father. He finished by saying I had built my claim on false paternity. I felt blood rush to my face. I started mentally reviewing dates, months, movements. Yes, I knew Javier's body had deteriorated, that there were things that weren't like before anymore, that many nights he barely had strength to hold my hand, but I never stopped to cross numbers in an agenda. For me, the child was his because that's how it had to be, because that's how everything closed, because in the middle of so much chaos one thing had to make sense. Hearing someone put a seal of impossibility on that in front of everyone was like having a floor I had propped up myself ripped away. My lawyer tried to question the dates, said bodies aren't exact machines, that reports can have a margin of error, that sometimes doctors record a moment as definitive when there are still small possibilities. He even suggested the idea that although the papers talked about sterility, there could always be exceptions. He even spoke about how a genetic analysis could clarify things, that the other side already had everything set up. They mentioned that a DNA test had never been requested, that there was never a formal paternity declaration by Javier, that everything was based on what I said. While they argued, I felt stares fixed on the back of my neck. The judge, the assistants, even some people who were there for other cases and had stayed to listen to the morbidity of a story that mixed illness, inheritance, and a child who maybe wasn't whose everyone believed. My hands burned with impotence. I wanted to say the dates could be off, that not everything can be measured with such rigidity, that there were intimate moments nobody recorded on paper, but I also knew that the more I spoke, the more they would use my words to shape the version that most suited them. At the end of that hearing, I was no longer just a woman claiming an inheritance. I was, in their eyes, someone interested who had lied about her child's paternity, a person who had latched onto a dead man's name to try to secure a roof. Nobody was seeing the sleepless nights, the vomiting, the screams of pain, the hands I held in the hospital. They only saw numbers, reports, and a child who, according to their calculations, couldn't be Javier's. I left the room with my sleeping son on my shoulder, a tight heart, and the feeling that from one moment to the next they had decided to turn me into the villain of a story I myself had sustained with my body. Update for. The sentence arrived a few months later, when I had already learned to live with the weight hanging from my head like a heavy cloud. I went to the courthouse with an empty stomach, more from nerves than lack of food. The judge read the ruling with the same monotonous voice people use to repeat news that doesn't affect them. He declared my claim on Javier's assets inadmissible. He said a formal union or economic dependence that would justify part of the inheritance had not been demonstrated. He mentioned that the presumed paternity of the child had not been proven, and that in light of the medical reports there were strong doubts about the veracity of what I had sustained. As if that weren't enough, he added that the process had evidenced elements of bad faith on my part. According to that paper, I had exaggerated, omitted, and accommodated facts to try to obtain an economic benefit. Therefore, they condemned me to pay the legal costs of Javier's family. The figures weren't gigantic compared to big TV trials, but for someone who counted coins for transportation and food, they were an impossible mountain to climb. The family's lawyer smiled barely, a minimal grimace, but enough to make clear he felt he had won something more than a case. The news didn't stay within those walls. Within days, the trial summary started circulating circulating. It didn't take anyone famous to share it. A few screenshots someone sent to a group were enough, and from there they jumped to others. Suddenly, people I hadn't talked to in years knew I had lost an inheritance trial, that the judge had doubted my word, and that on top of it they had written that surely the child wasn't Javier's son. The story got distorted with each repetition. Some said the judge had proven I had invented everything, others that they wanted to put me in jail and had only forgiven me because of the child. In the neighborhood where I rented, the atmosphere changed. The owner of the room, who until then had remained relatively neutral, started making comments about not wanting problems on his property. He insinuated that if the press showed up in the area or if any neighbor complained, he would have to ask me to vacate. Nobody came with cameras, but the murmurs reached. At the store they stopped greeting me the same way. Some neighbor women who used to sit and chat with me now crossed the street when they saw me coming. None said it to my face, but you could see in their eyes they had put a label on me. Rodrigo also found out. Of course, one night, while I was washing some borrowed dishes in the small sink of the room, a message arrived from an unknown number. It was short, cold. He thanked me for having confirmed that he had done himself a favor when I left. He didn't mention the child, didn't ask about anything. It was just a kind of closure, as if he needed that small written triumph to continue with his head held high in the life he had built without me. I didn't respond. I knew that in his head I was living proof of what he had always warned, that leaving with Javier was a madness with no return. With the label hanging over my name, getting work became even more complicated. Before, at least, I could enter houses to clean or care for elderly people and be seen as a woman in a hurry but normal. Now, every time I handed over my ID or filled out a form, I feared someone would search my name on the internet. Cut-off comments started arriving. A lady who had offered me to care for her mother changed her mind at the last minute, saying they had finally arranged with a niece. A couple who needed someone to clean stopped answering my messages after saying they would think about it. I ended up accepting jobs nobody wanted, endless days cleaning empty offices at night, caring for elderly people who didn't even remember my name, running errands for people who treated me as if I were part of the furniture. The money barely covered rent, some food, and the child's basic expenses. The trial costs were still there, like a debt that would grow if I didn't pay it, but nobody could take from where there wasn't. My lawyer, who at first showed interest in the case, now just said he was sorry that the system was like that maybe later something could be reviewed. I nodded, tired of fighting against walls. The worst wasn't just the money, it was the feeling of having lost the right to tell my story without being pierced with comments. Now every time I tried to explain something, the other person already wore the idea that I was that woman who left her husband for her ex, got pregnant by another man, and then wanted to take money from the dead man. That phrase, repeated in different forms, stuck like a stain on everything. It didn't matter what I said, the summary was already done and was much easier to remember than the details of everything that was in between. Date 5. Time things didn't improve, they just changed form. Almost 5 years have passed since Javier died, and if you look at it from the outside, my life seems like a circle that spins on itself without getting anywhere. My son is 4 years old. He's restless, curious, asks more than I sometimes have strength to answer. When he sees other children with their fathers, he stares for a while and then looks at me as if searching for something I can't quite give him. Sometimes he asks about his dad when he hears others talk about theirs. I tell him his dad is in heaven, that he takes care of him from there. It's simpler to keep the story in the heights than to bring all the details down to earth. The truth is, I don't know who his biological father is. That night of drinks remained blurred between loud music and the smell of alcohol. I remember loose fragments: a black shirt, big hands, a shared taxi. At the time I didn't think to keep names or numbers. My head was on Javier, on the tests, on the hospital. The rest was a parenthesis I preferred to close quickly. After the trial, when the paternity issue became a weapon against me, I tried to remember harder, search for faces in old photos, discreetly ask my friend if she remembered anything more. Nothing concrete, just shadows. Paying someone to investigate was never a real option. I can barely maintain the rent where we are and the month's food. The jobs I've managed to keep are those nobody wants, poorly paid and exhausting. I move from house to house, shift to shift, carrying with me a little bag with the child's toys in case I have to drag him somewhere. When I manage to leave him with some neighbor for a few hours, I feel as much relief as guilt. He's not to blame for anything, but he lives adapting to a broken rhythm he didn't choose. In the few free moments I have, when the child is already asleep and the neighbor's TV stops sounding, sometimes I turn on my phone and type my name in the search engine. The first thing that appears is still the trial summary. My name associated with words like abandonment, infidelity, unfounded claim. It doesn't matter how many nice photos I upload of my son or how many phrases I try to put about moving forward. What's visible, what anyone sees with 2 clicks, is that frozen version of me. It's strange to feel that for people who never saw you, you exist only as a case, as an anecdote. I haven't spoken to Rodrigo again. I know from random comments he rebuilt his life, that he moved, that he has a better job. Some say he's with someone, others that he's alone by choice. I'm not really interested in the sentimental part. What sometimes crosses my mind is that if things had been different, my son would have a firmer roof, a better school, a less tight future. But then I remember he closed the door in my face without hesitation, and the idea of imagining him as salvation passes. Everyone chose and lived with what they chose. I'm not allowed to forget that. Javier's family family disappeared from the map. They don't call, don't ask, don't send even a message for birthdays. It's as if the child had never existed for them, as if the part of the story that doesn't suit them could be erased with silence. Sometimes I think it was better that way, that it wasn't worth having close people who only know how to see you based on what they think you did wrong. Other times, when the child gets sick and I have to choose between taking him to a decent clinic or paying rent, I bite my tongue and wonder what everything would be like if they had agreed to help even a little. There are nights when I stay looking at the ceiling, listening to my son's soft breathing, and I review everything like a poorly edited movie. Javier's call, the argument with Rodrigo, the suitcase at the door, the hospital sheets, the pregnancy test, the wake, the doorbell at my ex-husband's house, the judge's ruling. I could try to assemble a more complacent version, say I was wrong about everything, that I should have stayed still in the first life I had and not move anything, but I would be lying to myself. In each moment I did what, according to me, made the most sense with what I felt and with what the world put in front of me. What hurts most isn't having made one decision or another, but seeing how in the end everything is reduced to labels that others repeat without thinking. For many people, I'm the bad woman who left her husband for an ex and on top of it ended up pregnant by a stranger. I'm the one who wanted to take money from a dead man, the one who was unmasked in front of a judge. Nobody sees the exhaustion in the bones, the sleepless hours, the sacrifices that don't appear on papers. My son unintentionally inherited that noise. He'll grow up hearing cut-out versions of something he didn't even ask to live. I keep going forward because there's no other option. I get up, work, take him to the park when I can, teach him to count, to say thank you, to not be afraid. Sometimes while I watch him play, I think that if something good came out of this whole chain, it's him. He's not to blame for the way he came into the world or for the stories that surround him. Someday he asks more seriously, I'll have to decide how much to tell him and how much to keep stored. For now, the only thing I keep firm is the idea that although everyone wants to reduce me to a label, I know how much I left on the road. The problem is that, unlike judicial rulings and gossip, that isn't written anywhere.